Bienvenue à Remote Daily, your daily dose of inspiration.
Can remote work fix societies? Our guest today has written and thought about this. He's the founder and chief executive officer of Tehama, a company offering the world's first carrier for work. Let's welcome Paul Vallee. Paul.
Thank you, Felix. I still remember the first time we met, Felix, at the floor at DLD. And I got to tell you, going back to Munich in person was a delight. And so these remote events, while they are incredibly important, they do contrast from those real life events. And there's lots to learn from the differences. And I think, we're entering into this interesting Empire Strikes Back era of remote work. If the dawn of the pandemic created a remote work opportunity for almost everyone whose work can be collected through a monitor, keyboard, mouse interface, like the way that we're interacting right now, it's obvious that there's like a larger movement afoot. I don't know if it's funded by big real estate or what, but there is a larger movement afoot to try to bring people back to the office now. And so I think it's a very pivotal and interesting time in remote work. And one of the things that prompted by you that I'm going to share is one of the things that's like a very important argument for remote work is just all the massive amounts of social benefits that emerge from structurally and systematically enabling a hybrid and remote workforce. And so that's really one of the most important things that's near and dear to my heart. And it was my original motivation to create a remote work business as a vehicle for my own career in the early stages of my career as well.
Paul, last year, when you joined us on this show for the first time, we had a deep dive from the 1970s to 2021 as our topic, a deep dive about remote work in large organizations. And you gave us this amazing arc of how it came up way earlier than most of us thought, because in the pandemic, everyone was like, oh, remote work, but it's been around for 50 years until 2021. Now it's 2022. And as you said before, the cards have shifted again. From your perspective, what are the biggest shifts between when you were on the show last time, between a year ago and now?
Well, I think that as certainly here in Canada, I know every country has its own regional, healthcare strategy, public health strategy, and government. But I think that, what has unified all of those strategies has been a certain amount of mandates for individuals to work from home if they could work from home. Mm-hmm. And I think those mandates for the most part are now gone. So a year ago when we were talking, I think a lot of us were in jurisdictions where we were being actively encouraged by public health authorities to work from home if it was remotely possible. And I think one major change that with those mandates gone, many organizations are trying to recall their employees back to the office. And so I'm familiar with a few different entities, for example, locally here, where they've tried to either recall their employees full-time or recall their employees 3 days a week of your choosing, or recall employees 1 day a week of a team consensus which day it would be. But I think there's definitely a large trend underway to try to get people to gather again for work productivity optimization reasons. And I think, for me, it's a discussion that is worthwhile having because, Felix, like we said earlier in the show, it is really nice to be able to interact with your colleagues in real life. And it is extremely valuable to recognize that people will strive, and sacrifice for their friends in ways that they just can't for strangers, and that friendships are more easily formed over a meal or over a social opportunity than they can be formed over Zoom. So there's a reason why this is happening. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for those of us who care about remote work for a variety of reasons, including how it can help heal some of the wounds in society over time, to be articulate about recognizing the need and trying to find ways to address the need without sacrificing some of the progress that we've made in the last couple of years as a result.
RTO, of course, our return to office. The heat is on in this conversation. What's your personal strategy? What have you chosen as a model and with your team?
Yeah. So our team meets and has met from before the pandemic until after the pandemic, and my team was already hybrid before the pandemic. So my team already included members that were not local here in Ottawa. We meet on Thursday mornings, and those of us who are, call it, within an hour's drive of the office, will all make an effort to meet in person on Thursdays, and then gather for lunch after that meeting on Thursdays. And that's what our team, the team of people that report to me, have agreed to do. We did not do that as an organizational mandate, and I'll tell you that while this is a consensus that emerged, it also doesn't come out as like marching orders from Paul, if you know what I mean. This is just like the team recognizing the utility and value of it, organizing to do this, as opposed to an actual organizational mandate. Across the company, I would say, walking around the office continues to be a little bit like visiting your grandmother's house after she passed away, which is to say that, you remember a lot of wonderful things that happened here, but it just feels like it will never quite recapture that again. And so I would definitely have that sense walking around the office. It's maybe 10 or 15% occupied on an average day, as opposed to the full as a percentage of the full occupancy from before the pandemic. And I think that's actually normal and something that we've come to accept. Our business enables remote work for our customers, and so it would be weird for us to roll out a mandate. Even if they are in vogue, it would be weird for us to roll out a mandate like that.
Wow, but the nostalgia you just described, walking around in the home of someone who passed, family member, I mean, it made me think about the nostalgia many people feel about Midtown Manhattan. There is currently, I think, occupancy around 40%. And a lot of people celebrate that, including the new mayor of New York City, who is very eager to, of course, have people return physically. But it also means that 60% of the people who used to build a whole sub-economy there of service providers, of hospitality, they're not there.
Yep.
So that nostalgia, I feel even here is still in many parts of the city is very much, you can feel it walking around. And do you think, though, that nostalgia will turn into a great opportunity for more affordable housing, for people taking back space in cities that have been so dense that there was no way to be on the upside of the real estate industry? Do you believe in that, even in your own place in Ottawa?
Well, we've already seen some commercial developments that were designed to be office space, seen those plans change while the building was still being constructed to become residential instead. So we definitely have seen a shift in demand in terms of the ratio of residential to commercial use in mixed use neighborhoods like the downtowns of cities. I can only imagine in Manhattan, 40% occupancy, maybe in a year it'll go to 60%, but there's still going to be 20 to 40% of the total capacity that is, a lot of people would love to live in Manhattan. And so I really do believe that there is going to be a changeover, and certainly that new development is going to match demand, present day demand, as opposed to historical demand. And I think that's pretty normal. The other major consequence in real estate is, we have to recognize, like, the city of Ottawa is now 1 million people, for example. So just think of any 1 million person city in your environs. If you imagine that city 50 years ago, it was 300,000 people. And that means that that development from 300,000 to 1 million represented an enormous amount of opportunity in the real estate market. An enormous amount of wealth got concentrated. One of the ways that remote work, I think, is hugely beneficial is to see existing 300,000 person cities, like maybe London, Ontario, or maybe 100,000 person cities like Cornwall, Ontario, that are within commuting distance to major cities. If by commuting distance we mean, call it 90 minutes, okay, or an hour. I believe that those cities represent enormous opportunities for us to resolve the problems that we currently have with millennials and Generation Z. And as a Canadian, I'll say Z, but we can say Z. Those individuals who really cut out of our economy's opportunity to generate wealth and generate growth, and for their opportunity to own a home the way their parents bought a home or the way that their grandparents bought a home. But they have to remember that the city that their grandparents bought a home in is not this city. Okay, the city that their grandparents bought a home in is this city 50 years ago at a third the size. Those cities that are a third the size exist, and they are within, with remote work, they are within stabbing distance of phenomenal career opportunities. And that's one of the things that I think I would be loath to sacrifice the hopefulness that the next generation can derive from knowing that they can have a phenomenal career and a beautiful home if they're willing to commute into town for an hour each way, but only once a week. That seems reasonable. It seems like that would be doable for a lot of people.
Wow. So talking about how remote work can fix society, you see a huge opportunity both for the inner city life, for space to be reclaimed or repurposed, and for commuting to be less frequent, therefore less stressful, but leading to a much easier life choice when saying, hey, I want to live outside of the city, but still work with a company that's inside a city, because there's just going to be one day maybe or 2 days where I have actually to sit in my car or on a train or bus to go to work, at least in the knowledge work environment that you operate in.
My curiosity is, how has the ability to take your job remote made your life better? And I think this is an important question that people have a wide variety. I already, for example, foreshadowed, maybe the ability to work remote has made your life better because you can afford to buy a house for the first time, because you can teleport yourself using the internet into your workplace instead of having to make that commute. That's one example. But people with, for example, people with disabilities have the opportunity to equip their homes in different ways. So, I mean, I'm just curious to learn, how individually here, the ability to teleport ourselves to our workplaces using it has made your life better.
We have already a few answers here in the chat. Eileen actually puts in 3 things that we could discuss, Paul. Increase clients, so business, reduce local travel, climate emissions, more personal time, well-being, mental health. While Rashad is saying, you know what, for me, it hasn't actually made my life better. It has made me more lonesome. So here you have, in just 2 of our community members, the full range of what was going on in the pandemic. And in this time where remote work became the status quo for all of us, as you said, even mandated in many places in the world. And I want to say, for everybody who was caretaker in the pandemic and everybody who was alone, I think it was equally stressful for both sides. So I very much relate with Rashad. But of course, you just mentioned it, Paul, right? The upticks, the business opportunities, the global travel that saved so many carbon emissions during this time and is now ticking up like crazy, and the personal time that so many people enjoyed. So what do you make out of this panorama that we see here in responses?
Yeah, certainly for increased clients. I mean, I had a similar motivation when I first founded Pythian in 1997. And so in 1997, I was 25 years old, and I had been working in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And for personal reasons, I needed to return to Ottawa, where I had set up a home. And, Ottawa is a beautiful place to live. It's a beautiful place to be. We're the nation's capital. The National Ballet dances here. The National Theater plays here. The National Orchestra plays here. So many of the nation's cultural institutions are here. But I really felt like my career had been cut off at the knees, because the size of the city and the technology that I had become an expert in were out of whack, in that I just didn't have a large number of prospective customers here. And as a result, there was not a good job market for the skills that I knew how to do. And as a result, I felt like I was really had achieved a premature boredom and mastery in my career. Instead of, continuing to grow and develop myself and test myself, I really felt stagnant. And so I, as a technologist and as a early internet user, I was aware of the necessary networking technologies that might permit me to do the kind of very command line oriented, in the bowels of technology infrastructure work that I knew how to do. It didn't really matter to us. If the machine was in a data center, it didn't really matter to us database and systems administrators, whether that machine was in the data center, like in Ottawa, or a data center in the basement of the same building, or a data center 3,000 kilometers away. It didn't really change much due to the magic of TCP/IP and the internet. As these ensuing 25 years has gone by, obviously, the number of things that you can do using purely networking technologies has grown. And that's why, you know, when the pandemic burst on the scene, we actually surprised ourselves with the sheer amount of jobs that could be done without being physically present. So for me, the biggest thing was this career opportunity that it created for me, this opportunity to do things on a global level, at a global scale that was otherwise impossible. It also, much like you, Felix, created a career opportunity for my entrepreneurship. So much like you were mentioning, like, you know, the reason that this Remote Daily exists is because of this explosion in remote work. And so this kind of career opportunity was there for me as well. I must say, as someone who was CEO, even though I wasn't a remote work company, I also really love the reduced travel. I think that, you know, I was spending 100 nights a year on the road for work. It affected my ability to be a good father. It affected my ability to be a good partner. It definitely was exhausting, and definitely, I mean, that amount of restaurant eating is just bad for you. Let's just agree. Like, not to mention, you know, the kinds of social opportunities that I was constantly foisted into. Also,
Of course.
It was on some level great and energizing, but on the other hand, also exhausting and physically demanding. And so I think that reduced global and local travel is also a net benefit. And of course, you know, working from home is just so comfortable. I mean, it's just so comfortable to be able to walk to your fridge and make yourself a healthy meal at lunch instead of, you know, having to pack it the night before, and all of these other things that are, I think, these little conveniences that we've become quite addicted to, which is what leads to the very predictable revolt when you're trying to attract people back into the office. As far as loneliness, I mean, I have to say, this is the mental health consequences of remote work are real. And for those who are struggling with that, I mean, I would highly recommend finding a local coffee shop and working from a coffee shop instead of working from home alone. A certain amount of social interaction, you'll see after a week of working in that coffee shop, you'll know the names of everybody who works there. You may even struggle to pay for your coffee refills because they'll have grown accustomed to you and learned to like you. And if you address them by name, they'll address you by name. Before you know it, they're your colleagues. It doesn't really matter if it's a Starbucks or if it's a WeWork. Once you start going to a place where other people are and congregating, you will find that community. And it's very worthwhile for you to bust out of your, you know, basement or whatever, and re-engage in the world and be present with others. Even if they're not your direct colleagues, you'll quickly get to know them, and it's extremely helpful. Something that I recommend, partly because when I was in Minneapolis, I was also alone. And even just being alone in the evenings, I found extremely depressing, to be honest. And finding a little cafe in my neighborhood where I would just decide this is my hangout, and it's going to cost me, you know, $7 in hibiscus tea every evening, but it's money well spent because it's going to let me find community, and it absolutely worked.
Fascinating. So to our big question, can remote work fix society? Next to the inner city space, the commuter opportunities with flexible schedules, you would add actually less travel as an upside. Well, and therefore,
because I mean, I still want to travel, but I want to take vacations now instead of traveling for work all the time. You know, I want to get out in the world, but I don't necessarily want to get out in the world constantly, go from office tower to office tower. There is no difference between Munich and Cologne if you're traveling for work. This is just one series of office towers versus another series of office towers.
Now, on the downside, though, and I think Rashad made that very clear, that the damage has been done in many people's lives and many people's physical and psychological well-being. What other challenges do you see remote work face in the upcoming years? What are some big things where you say those are real problems and I don't know whether they can be fixed.
Yeah. Well, so I don't really know if it's funded by big real estate or not, but there definitely is a lot of science, like research, social sciences research, business school research being published now, trying to kind of calibrate our expectations around how productive a team can be in a fully remote mode and what sacrifices are being made when you choose a fully remote mode. Just this week, a new study was published around the quantity and quality of ideas that are generally shared in a meeting that's hosted over Zoom when compared to a comparable meeting hosted in real life. Now, I hope everyone in this session is savvy enough and not so naive to just fall for that and would want to review that study, because it seems to me extremely difficult to measure the quality of an idea just in the first place. I mean, I'm in meetings and sometimes I hear like, well, that's a good idea. And I immediately think that's going to need a test to know if it's a good idea or not. And then I think I can't even afford to run that test to know if this is a great idea or not, which means I'll never really know for sure if this is a phenomenal out of the box thinking idea, or if it's just a mediocre idea. So measuring the quality of an idea is a dark art. And I don't think it really is as simple as saying that Zoom calls don't generate as much quality ideation. But that being said, I think that there is definitely, evidence that when you take people and put them in a formal context where their name is under their video, they tend to, their contributions tend to be taken at face value without being pushed quite as much as when people are jumbled up together and may not know each other as well. I also think that there is, some benefit to the social brainstorming sessions that happen over a lunch or over a dinner that are very difficult to replicate remotely. In fact, at Pythian, we would do a 2 or 3 week orientation period to get everybody to build a huge amount of social connective tissue. And then we do mashups with at least once a year, so people would spend at least a week together in the same city. And ultimately, the reason is to make sure that this kind of big picture thinking doesn't need to happen every day, but it does need to happen every 3-4 times a year. You need to have that kind of like, let's take a step back and think bigger. And it's extremely difficult to catalyze that kind of conversation in a fully remote work mode over the longer term.
I want to go back to what you said about the studies, and I guess we're all following them. They're creating big headlines. There was now a study about VR, virtual reality at work, that just came out, and I don't even want to share the link here because, again, when you look into the methods, it's very questionable sometimes. So it's always recommended when you see a study that puts remote work either way, super positively or super negatively, to look into the methods. Here, 16 in this VR study, 16 test subjects spend an entire 40-hour work week in VR, which means with goggles, with a commercially available setup. So they use the Meta goggles and a Logitech keyboard with a trackpad. And after that week, they were being tracked and tested. And after the week, they were more exhausted than the other group that didn't use the headsets. Conclusion, VR at work doesn't really work. And I find that not a great way to discuss this topic, to be honest, because who would think that spending 40-hour work week behind goggles would be a good idea in the first place? I don't think any company is aiming for that.
Yeah.
And you're laughing, but it's the headline I think that was shared was working in the metaverse is going to suck.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what can I say? I'm actually glad I'm looking at the grid view of this session, and many have their cameras off. And I actually encourage this because, to me, I mean, obviously it would be inappropriate for me to turn my camera off. I'm presenting. But if I'm on camera like this,
right,
I will say maximum 2 hours a day, I am completely exhausted. And it is just a very heavy burden on your cognition to be on camera, to feel like you're being observed, to feel like you're, to look for signal around, hi Rashad, to look for signal around eye contact that is absent, and yet it is so built into our literally animal level cognition. Is this person paying attention to me? To what degree do they agree or disagree? But all of that body language being absent or encoded in a way that is corrupted, because I mean, if you're looking at me, you're not looking at your camera. But since you're not looking at your camera, you're not giving me eye contact. You see what I mean? So this corrupted,
yes, constant stress.
It's incredibly exhausting over time. And so I don't think virtual reality is going to inherently immediately fix these problems. And if it did, it will not be in its first iterations. These are the kinds of challenges that will take, well, we talked about the long arc of remote work starting from the 70s with the back office outsourcing to India at scale. If you follow that long arc, we made a ton of progress, but it did take us those 50 years, and so I believe that even at an accelerated breakneck pace of technology progression, we are going to be 10 to 20 years before we can do anything to simulate the kind of comfort that we have in real life.
So talking of the challenges, we now expressed, we talked about the challenge of how to use the technology right. That's still hard to fix. We talked about the challenge of access that's still not there for a lot of people. And what we haven't talked about is harassment. You said there's an opportunity, when we prepared for the session, you said there's an opportunity to desexualize the workplace with remote work. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I'm a big believer in a desexualized workplace. So for myself, in a city of 1 million people, to have to pick one of these 80 to entangle yourself with romantically, it's just a career mistake. It's a mistake for the individuals, I feel, and I'll explain why in a second. And it's a mistake for the business as well. Now, if we 80 are interacting purely over Zoom, the likelihood that we will entangle that way goes down. And I'll just explain quickly why I think this is to the benefit of everyone. I think it's to the benefit of the workplace, so the employer. It's the benefit of the employer because I think we've all seen situations where when a romantic relationship between employees ends, people either quit or look for a reassignment, and this is not necessarily to the benefit of the business. So I think if you haven't experienced that, I mean, at Pythian's maximum size under my leadership, we were about 500 people, and it was happening twice a year that something like this would happen. Another good example, I think, is it is very innocent flirtations are not always innocent because they redefine a relationship. And at Pythian, with 500 people, I presided over multiple happy marriages that resulted in happy children and happy families. And I'm delighted for those people. Don't get me wrong. Don't misinterpret me. I'm delighted for the happy outcomes. But based on my own dating history, by the time I was married, I'd had several relationships that were flawed and had failed, that had become serious. By the time I had serious relationships, I'd had maybe a dozen dates per serious relationship. And for each of those dozen dates, I might have, flirted more innocently with a dozen or more people, which means that for us to have had 5 marriages, there were literally thousands of flirtations, each of which made it very difficult for at least one party to that flirtation to feel like they were being taken seriously as an intellectual, as opposed to being respected for their intelligence or for their competence or for their capabilities. Now, those reframings of those relationships, I think they cause harm to the social fabric of a business, because when people don't know for sure if their ideas are being taken at face value and honored, they're deprived of some important feedback that they need to know if they're on the right track or not, right? And at the same time, it becomes uncomfortable for, sadly, we're never going to dismantle the patriarchy unless we develop the next generation of women leaders. And being a phenomenal leader relies on a heavy amount of mentorship. And it is very uncomfortable in this Me Too context for senior men to mentor young women in the same way that they feel very confident and comfortable mentoring young men. So a senior male executive with a young man out one-on-one to lunch, nobody raises an eyebrow. a senior male executive with a young woman out one-on-one to lunch, people are concerned. And that concern, it creates a drag on the amount of mentorship that young women receive. Now, Zoom fixes all of this. Nobody is concerned about a one-to-one meeting happening over Zoom. Nobody thinks you're being inappropriate. And to a certain degree, it also reduces the likelihood of that occurring. And so, I mean, the fact that everybody can easily take a recording of every conversation also reduces the likelihood of misbehavior. And so I think there are benefits there from a diversity and inclusion. Another good example of diversity and inclusion is just people who have physical disabilities of some description. To a single last person, they have found a way to get comfortable in their homes and optimize their home life. But even the burden of a commute is a huge burden to people who are in a wheelchair or who must walk on crutches or who have a visual impairment. And asking them and forcing them to do that commute is a huge burden. And then they have to, be in a workplace where they're just not as comfortable all day long as well. And so I think there's a large diversity and inclusion reasons why we should be championing remote work.
There are numbers that are sort of oppose your opinion on the desexualized workplace, as there have been studies that said, again, we're with the studies, right, that said that harassment went up, or that even more people have experienced it and talked about it. So what we come back to is, I guess, your solution of saying, because of course a one-on-one Zoom call can be super weird, especially when both are at home and there's sort of like social references in the background, but you have to educate people on how to record, how to access those recordings, how to use those recordings, and also who to share recordings with in case something is happening that is not appropriate. So again, we're talking about, yes, we can fix it, but you have to give people the tools or enable them to be able to control their environment in a remote place, because then it becomes a really powerful tool for everybody to feel safe in. Last question for you. There have been big headlines about Canadian IT. Today is not the brightest day of Canadian IT, but this one was teaming up with SpaceX to install Starlink internet into a remote Indigenous community. You wrote a whole article about this, which I'm going to share in the chat, with the headline, "The Remote Works Revolution Could Spark Essential Job Creation and Economic Empowerment for First Nations." So a huge topic, of course, very near and dear to huge places all around the world, like Canada. Do you think remote work really has a chance to eventually fix life in communities that don't even have access to internet right now?
Well, okay, so no meaningful problem has a single solution. Okay, so let's just admit right on the face of it that reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples of Canada is not going to be solved with one thing. It's going to be solved with 100 things done over a long time frame. Okay, so for sure, it is a meaningful problem. The dimension of the problem that I focus on with this op-ed, thanks for sharing it, Felix. The dimension of the problem that I focus on is the history of our Indigenous community in Canada is one that is dominated by the residential schools policy. And if you're not familiar, in Canada, there was a government policy of essentially kidnapping young children, bringing them into boarding schools far away from home and community, and from those boarding schools, forbidding their use of Indigenous language or their practice of Indigenous culture or rituals, and thereby essentially alienating them from their elders and depriving them of the continuity of their culture. I just want to point out, if you are a brilliant, ambitious individual who happens to have been born in one of these remote communities, your life is currently a continuity of that whole, in that you are going to need to leave town to go to if you are interested in the arts, if you're going to go to an art school and you think you're going to find that in your tiny community, you are not. You're going to need to leave town. If you want to then pursue your relationship, your academic performance at the university level, again, you're going to have to go. And if you are going to get a great career, you're not going to find that great career at your you might be able to find a great career as a carpenter, but to great career, from a lot of the tasks that we are now performing remotely, you're going to need to leave your community to do, which means that you're going to go from a small town into the larger city, where you will go through your normal college experience, which means, falling in love and maybe finding a great set of friends. And next thing you know, to what degree are you turning your back on your indigenous cultures? And have we created, with modern economic structures, have we recreated the residential schools problem just due to people's, individual ambition? I believe remote work and remote education, which of course we might not be talking about in this context, but is also extremely important part of that recipe, gives that youth, the opportunity to stay and develop their capabilities from home, and then have a phenomenal career from home, and then create economic influxes of cash as a result of having that phenomenal career from home. And so I believe there is a ESG. ESG is like a governance movement around environmental and social governance in larger orgs. I believe there's an important ESG reason to be fighting for remote work, because it does help heal the rural-urban divide, help develop rural economies, and ultimately contributes, does not solve, but contributes to a solution around reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples of Canada, by showing them that they can be phenomenal contributors to our academic, our research, and our economy, while remaining committed to their culture and house and home that is their heritage. So that's something that's very important. I mean, I'm saying this in the middle of a city that is on unceded Algonquin territory. I fully acknowledge that it is a major issue and major unsolved problem in Canada, is how do we make it such that the opportunities that we have created are shared equally by people, regardless of their geography, including geographical constraints that are the only path to maintaining the continuity of their cultural heritage.
So I guess the answer to our question today, can remote work fix society? The answer is, it may be helpful to some of the problems. How to fix society? Well, Zoom won't do that, but it can help us in having many, many, many of the problems. And I just want to sum up a few that you mentioned: real estate, urban life, access, diversity, climate, education, and mental health. These were all things we touched on today to bring us a little closer to develop some solutions there. And your final point in saying we should make remote work ESG, a sustainable development goal, is, I think, really an interesting one. So thank you for putting that strong statement out there. And I can only say thank you, Paul. And if you have a virtual glitter in you right now and you want to stretch out your hands for a final stretch for this hour, please do so, Paul. It was a pleasure to have you with us. This was Remote Daily. Thanks to everyone who was here today. Paul, it's been a huge pleasure to host you.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Bye.